morning, everybody. UB here, and today I'm going to show you a challenging but beginner-friendly woodworking project. I needed a display to hang my fine art from for a show that I did recently, so I decided to make a 3-panel chicken wire display that I could use S-hooks on and then just hang my frames and what have you from it. Like I said, this is pretty beginner friendly and you can make it as small or as big as you want if you have a rustic kitchen or the like. So let's get started. Let's take a look at some of the supplies that you're going to need for this project. If you don't have a pocket hole guide, that is okay. You can do the corners in a number of different ways, but you'll definitely need hinges for in between the panels, some screws, a straight edge, a tape measure, your safety gear, and I actually didn't end up using the nails at all, so we are just sticking with screws on this project. This is something where a table saw comes in really handy. Actually, I think this is a miter saw. I'm really bad with my saw types. But if you don't have such a thing, you can saw these by hand fairly easily, or you can use a smaller saw. Just make sure that you're following all of the safety instructions for whatever saw you do use. All of the cuts for the frame are going to be at 45-degree angles, and that's just so that everything comes together in a square nice and neatly. My long pieces were approximately 5 feet tall, and my short pieces were 20 inches long. Once you have one piece cut to satisfaction, you can just use that piece as a template to mark out all of your other pieces before you cut. So what makes this a beginner-friendly project? Well, it's going to use a lot of the basic tools you're going to need in a wood shop or a craft shop if you're doing a lot of pieces like this. It gets you familiar with using things like a saw, a drill, all of that good stuff. And if you haven't used a pocket hole drill guide before, I highly recommend it. Alright, so these are the pieces that we're left with at this point, and we've got 6 of these long pieces in total, which is perfect because I want 3 panels. And then we've got the ends that I cut off of those. What I think I want to do with these, even though they're a little ugly and beat up, is I want to figure out how wide I want each panel to be, and then cut these to that length. And this will be the top and bottom of each panel. Yeah, that maths. So let's get back on the saw, do a little bit of math, and I will be back here in a few moments. The other thing is that the math on this project is not terribly cumbersome. and you can make it fit whatever space you need it to. In fact, you don't even need to make a project this big in order to use the steps that I'm showing you. You could just make a wall hanging in a rustic style kitchen, or make one panel to go in a doorway if you are trying to keep cats or kids out of a certain part of your house, kind of like a baby gate. But maybe don't use it around your babies. Could be a little dangerous. Just remember, whatever style you decide to make this project in, make sure that the use case is safe and that you're using all of your protective equipment and being safe when you make it. All right, I don't know about you, but I feel pretty great about how the frames are sitting at this point. But it is lunchtime, so I'm going to take a break, eat something, and we'll come back and finish that up. The big challenge here is assembly. There are a number of methods you can use to connect the corners of all of your frames, but I used pocket holes. Other methods that exist include using a special kind of wood glue and taping it up very tightly overnight. Or you could use a specific kind of bracket that's kind of wavy that you can find in most hardware stores. There's also a method where you can basically Lincoln log the pieces together. You have to miter out the edges, and that can be a little tricky, especially if you're a beginner. So pick your poison before you start the project. Right angle corner clamps also make this project a lot easier. You don't necessarily need them, and you can very tightly tape everything together to dry, but the corner clamps really do add a little bit of ease to the process. This step is completely optional, but if you're using a pocket hole guide like I was, you can fill in those holes once you have everything put together and sand it down, and it makes a very nice finish. I was also filling in some of the more ugly chunks that were missing as I went along in this process. Be cognizant of the pretty side and the less pretty side of whatever boards you're using. You may pick better boards than I did, but mine really were a little gnarly, so I had to be very careful what side I was making the back of the frame that nobody was ever gonna see, and what side I was making the front of the frame, which was a lot prettier. With wood filler like this, you can start with a more coarse sandpaper, and if you're really looking for a nice finish, you can go in with a fine sandpaper to finish everything up, but you just want to get the big chunks kind of squared away and get everything flush before you go in with the fine sandpaper. And as always with wood filler, you might need to do a couple of coats to make sure that all of the little cracks and crevices are filled properly. Once everything is assembled, I took all of the pieces outside and brushed on basically a deck sealant. It's not a true stain, and these boards were pine, so I kind of liked the little color that it had to it naturally. So this is a clear sealer that I found at Lowe's, and it was relatively inexpensive, and I only used about half the can on this project. And now for everybody's favorite part, installing the chicken wire. This was a little tricky and there was a bit of a learning curve to it. So, with this first piece, I cut it to length first and then cut it to the width. But what I found was that when you're cutting the width off, that's a much smaller piece than when you're cutting the length. So, I struggled through this first piece getting that little chunk off of the side, but realistically, it's much easier to do what I did with the second panel and third, which is to weigh down the end of the chicken wire, roll it out to length, and then cut off that side before you cut it to length. You can see the box is weighing everything down, and it's really easy to just snip off that side and then cut it to length. And repeat for panel 3. Alright, so we're on like day 4 or 5 of this. I've got my stapler and my already cut out pieces of chicken wire. What I'm going to do is attach the chicken wire to each of the frames. I just want to focus on getting the chicken wire attached to the frame, and I'm going to try to put 3 to 5 inches between each staple, but we'll see with how big the chicken wire is how that actually turns out. So first, let's make sure that we're stapling this to the back of each frame. The ugly part. Well, I guess I'm waiting for Nathaniel to come home and show me where the staples live. Just kidding. Nathaniel told me that there's a battery-operated staple gun, so we're gonna use that. Ooh. Okay. Oh, we have a third stapler. Fingers crossed. Staplers are also not terribly expensive, but I would suggest maybe borrowing one from a friend if you can. So I want to share a little tip with you that I actually learned from my friends who do a lot of jewelry making. Specifically, my wire wrapping friends out there. If you have an end kind of like this, where it's a little loose and you want to wrap 2 pieces of wire together, you can use a drill or a Dremel like this. And basically what you have to do is you open up the chuck on the drill, and then switch directions. Then you put the wire end inside that chuck and tighten it. And then once the drill is tightened around that end, What you can do is just slowly twist it together. Ooh. And then release the chuck. If you over tighten with this method though, it will break off just like that. So let's see if we can do one the right way, just to show you an example. All right, and then we loosen the chuck and pull away, and it's all tightened up there. You can tighten it further by hand if needed, but this is a great place to start if you're doing a project like this. As far as hinges go, the size you want is going to depend on your project. These came in a 2-pack at the hardware store, so I just bought 3 2-packs, and that was enough for 3 panels. Always make sure to pre-drill your holes so that your screws will go in nice and easy, and you won't be cracking any of your wood. When you put in your first couple of screws, you can leave them a little bit loose so that you can move the panel around a little bit in order to find the holes for the other screws, and then just go back and tighten them before you move on to the next hinge. And repeat 5 more times. The last step I wanted to do for my purposes was to make and install little feet that would swivel out in order to protect the venue's floor from this contraption that I've made. You can find these small boards, they're called craft boards, at the hardware store, and they're not very thick, but they're just nice enough to round out this project. If you're making a wall hanging, you obviously don't need feet for that, but I basically chose a length that I wanted, mitered the edges off to be slanted, and then screwed a hole in the middle of each one. I started with a small bit, basically just prepping the wood to be drilled through with the screw, and then after taking that small bit through each piece, I switched to a larger bit. I drilled very shallowly to create a little space for the head of the screw to sit when it gets screwed in so that it sits flush with the surface of the foot. And then I also pre-drilled into the frames. When you do this, you want to leave the screw just a little loose so that the feet can swivel. You may have to use a hand screwdriver to just do a half a turn or what have you to make the screw just loose enough. And then I took some felt and cut it down to size for each foot because I wanted to protect the floors of the venue I'm going to be at with this contraption. The felt just makes it a little nicer on the floors. And I used some wood glue. ... Not a lot applies here. And if you're more comfortable using a paintbrush to brush on this glue, be my guest. And then pressed the felt onto the bottom of each foot. You may notice here that the mitering that I did to make a 45-degree angle, I accidentally screwed each foot on upside down. But that's the choice that we made, and we're gonna deal with it. And just to make sure that everything dried nicely, I rubber banded a piece of scrap wood to each foot to make sure that the felt was pressed tightly against the wood while it dried. These work fantastically because I can just swivel them in when I need to put this piece in my car and swivel them out when it needs a little more stability. So I'm going to do one last step before I call her done. This step is optional, but if you have kids or pets at home, it's probably a good idea. And that is to go on the back here and make sure that all of the little pokies from the wire, the chicken wire, are covered up and aren't going to poke anybody. So I think we're going to go with felt. And I'm just going to get this cut to size, glued on, and then we'll call her good. And that's a wrap on the chicken wire display. I did make a handful of mistakes on this project that I do want to point out, including things like using the wrong kind of screw in my pocket holes, trying to do experimental things on the corners of my frames, and even accidentally sealing in some of my pencil marks on the wood. I am going to upload a PDF instruction manual to create your own chicken wire display. If you'd like to see that, it's going to be available for free on Patreon. And if you follow me for free, you'll get a lot of other little freebies whenever I post a video. Thank you so much for getting to the end of the video. Here's 1,000 experience points just for that. You're a rock star. Thank you for bearing with me. I know it's been over a month since I last posted. I do have a couple of projects already filmed, but who knows when I'm going to get around to editing them, so please bear with me. Have a great rest of your day. Don't forget to drink some water, and I will see you again soon. Peace.